The American West was not silent. It groaned under wagon wheels, shouted across canyon walls, and hummed with the desperate energy of a nation stretching itself toward an ocean it had not yet seen. And threading through all of it, fragile and defiant, moved something the people of that frontier needed almost as much as water: a letter. In the years following the Civil War, the American continent was split in two by distance and silence. A man who left Ohio for California in 1849 might not speak to his mother again for 3 years, not because he did not want to, not because she did not write, but because there was no reliable way to carry those words across 2,000 miles of desert, mountain, and unmarked grass. The story of the Wild West mail system is the story of how a nation refused to accept that silence. When the United States acquired the vast territories of the Southwest following the Mexican-American War in 1848, Washington faced a problem it had never encountered in quite this form. The new lands were populated by native peoples, by Mexican settlers, by trappers and prospectors and drifters, but they were not connected. The Post Office Department, which had operated with some reliability along the eastern seaboard for decades, now found itself responsible for delivering correspondence across terrain that cartographers had not yet finished drawing. The first serious attempt came in 1851. Congress passed the Postal Act of that year, slashing postage rates and expanding the mandate of the post office westward. A letter could now be sent across the country for 3 cents. The problem was not the price. The problem was the road. The stagecoach was the spine of Western mail delivery for the better part of 2 decades. Companies like Wells Fargo, the Overland Mail Company, and the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express, a name so unwieldy that even its own employees simply called it the Overland, operated routes stretching hundreds and eventually thousands of miles. John Butterfield's Overland Mail Company secured a government contract in 1857 to carry mail along what became known as the Oxbow Route. The Southern Trail ran from St. Louis southwest through Texas, across New Mexico and Arizona, then north through California to San Francisco. The total distance was roughly 2,800 miles. Butterfield promised delivery in 25 days. Competitors laughed. Then, on September 16, 1858, the first overland mail coach rolled into San Francisco, having completed the journey in 23 days and 23 hours. The crowd that met it reportedly could not stop cheering. A stagecoach carried more than letters. It carried the emotional weight of the frontier. Inside those leather pouches, wrapped against weather and dust and the occasional river crossing, were things of incalculable private value. A wife writing to tell her husband that the baby had survived. A mother sending a daguerreotype to a son who had not been home in 4 years. A soldier describing the color of the California sky to a sister who had never left Pennsylvania. The men who drove these coaches understood what they carried. Most of them did not talk about it, but they understood. The driver's bench was not a comfortable place to understand anything. A standard Concord coach, the dominant vehicle of the era, built in New Hampshire and shipped in pieces to assembly stations across the West, could weigh nearly 3,000 pounds fully loaded. It was suspended not on metal springs, but on thick leather thorough braces, which absorbed some of the road's violence, but not nearly all of it. A driver worked 14 to 18-hour stretches, changing horses every 10 to 15 miles at relay stations that might be nothing more than a dugout and a water trough. Attacks by road agents, the period's preferred term for stagecoach robbers, were common enough that Wells Fargo eventually maintained its own system of armed messengers called shotgun messengers. The job title was not metaphorical. The shotgun messenger rode beside the driver, responsible for the strongbox and the mail, and was expected to defend both with lethal force if necessary. Many of them did. There are moments in American history that are remembered not because they succeeded, but because of what they represented at the moment of their attempt. The Pony Express was one of them. Launched on April 3rd, 1860, by the freighting firm of Russell, Majors and Waddell, the Pony Express promised to carry mail from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. And asymptotically, the method was simple and punishing. A single rider, carrying a mochila, a flat leather pouch that draped over the saddle with 4 lockable pockets, would ride between stations approximately 10 to 15 miles apart. At each station, he would dismount, transfer the mochila to a fresh horse in under 2 minutes, and ride on. Every 75 to 100 miles, a new rider would take over. The entire system required around 400 horses, 190 stations, and 80 riders at any given time. The men recruited for this work were not large. Advertisements of the era reportedly specified riders who weighed no more than 125 pounds. They would be riding at full gallop across terrain that had defeated men twice their size. The horses were selected for endurance and speed, not comfort. The riders were expected to maintain that gallop regardless of weather, darkness, hostile encounters, or their own physical condition. The fastest documented run of the Pony Express carried the text of President Lincoln's inaugural address from St. Joseph to Sacramento in 7 days and 17 hours. It was a stunning achievement. It was also, within 18 months, completely obsolete. On October 24th, 1861, the transcontinental telegraph line was completed. The message sent that day by the Chief Justice of California to President Lincoln announced the fact directly. California remained loyal to the Union, and the telegraphic connection now proved it in an instant. 2 days later, the Pony Express ceased operations. The company had never been profitable. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had invested approximately $700,000 in the enterprise, roughly $22 million in contemporary value, and recovered perhaps half of it. The venture was not a failure, exactly. It demonstrated that rapid overland communication was possible. It trained riders and established stations that would be used by subsequent mail contracts. But the telegraph did in a single season what no horse could do. It made distance irrelevant. For the written letter, however, the story was far from over. The telegraph could carry a message, but not a package. It could relay words, but not the handwriting behind them. The mail did not stop moving. It simply changed how it moved. The solution that ultimately transformed Western mail delivery was not a horse or a rider. It was a converted railway car. In 1864, a postal clerk named William A. Davis began experimenting with the idea of sorting mail while it was in transit. The traditional method required mail to arrive at a central post office, be sorted by hand, and then be distributed onward. The entire process at each stop could take hours, sometimes days. Davis's insight was to move the sorting operation onto the train itself. By the time the train reached its destination, the mail would already be organized and ready for final delivery. The result was the Railway Mail Service, formally established in 1869, the same year the Transcontinental Railroad was completed with the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, Utah. The RMS clerks who staffed these cars were among the most rigorously tested federal employees of the era. A candidate for railway mail clerk was expected to memorize the post offices, towns, and distribution patterns for an entire region of the country. Examinations were known to feature hundreds of individual sorting challenges under timed conditions. Failure rates were high. Those who passed were given a car, a sorting case, a canvas bag for each destination, and a route. The work was violent in its way. Railway cars swayed and lurched. Mail was thrown at sorting cases at speed. Clerks sorted standing up, often for entire transcontinental runs, sleeping in narrow bunks between shifts and waking to sort again. The pay was modest. The retirement rate from injuries was not. In the towns themselves, the post office was not merely a functional building. It was a social institution. In communities where newspapers arrived weeks late and gossip was the primary news medium, the post office was where the two intersected. Mail call was an event. Men and women who might otherwise have no reason to enter town on a given day would ride in specifically to ask if anything had come. The postmaster, in many small Western communities, occupied a position of considerable informal power. He, and occasionally, in widowhood or circumstance she, knew whose letters were arriving and from where. This information was not always kept private. In a community of 50 people living on the same watershed, the arrival of a letter from a land agent in Denver was information that would not stay secret long. The Star Route System, authorized by Congress to extend mail delivery to areas not served by rail or stagecoach, hired private contractors to carry mail along routes marked in postal directories with a star, indicating the route required celerity, certainty, and security, the three qualities considered essential to federal mail service. Star route carriers were some of the most isolated workers in the American West. They rode mules into mountain communities accessible only by single-track trails. They crossed flooded rivers and worked through blizzards under contractual obligation to deliver on schedule regardless of conditions. The penalties for missed deliveries were financial. The conditions that caused them were not. The Wild West mail system was not a single thing. It was layered, improvised, commercially motivated, federally mandated, and constantly renegotiated between the government, private contractors, and the landscapes that resisted both. It failed frequently. Letters were lost to flooding, fire, robbery, and simple human error. Packages arrived months late. Soldiers wrote home and received no reply, not because their families had not written, but because the reply had simply ceased to exist somewhere between the Mississippi and wherever the soldier was standing. And yet it persisted, and it delivered. And the people who depended on it, the miners and homesteaders and cavalry troopers and school teachers and widows and merchants who constituted the frontier, continued to believe that the next mail would come, that their words would reach the people they had left behind, that the distance was not permanent. That belief was not naive. It was the foundation of something. In the archives of the Smithsonian And in county historical societies across a dozen Western states, thousands of those letters still exist. They have survived, not because anyone thought to preserve them at the time, but because the people who received them could not bring themselves to throw them away. They were proof that someone had thought of them, that someone had found paper and ink and the cost of postage, and had sat down in whatever lean-to or cabin or mining camp they inhabited, and had addressed those words to a specific person across an impossible distance. The Wild West mail system carried those words, imperfectly, expensively, sometimes at the cost of lives, and always against terrain that had no interest in cooperating. But it carried them. In the end, that is what the mail has always been. Not a system, not a network, not a contract between a government and its citizens. A promise that the distance between people is not the final word.